facts every day. We discuss in-depth stories with sources behind the facts.
The Lagos State High Court has convicted, suspended the Chicago certificate story. It's never going away, is it? Show with stories for the day.
You hear diverse voices and opinions.
And she was meeting campaign with her husband, knowing that.
You should not be happy because there is nothing to happy about.
Yeah, it's quite pathetic the way the country is going.
We distinguish each story accurately with analysis.
It's Hard Facts with Maryann Okon on 99.3 Nigeria Info. This is Hard Facts.
This is the nation's #1 talk news and sports radio station, 99.3 Nigeria Info. We're broadcasting live from our audiovisual studios right here in Etimeyan Crescent, Victoria Island, Lagos. This is Hard Fact. I am Maryann Okon. And on the big Hard Facts today, we're talking electoral reforms. Joining me live via Zoom is the head of programs, YIAGA Africa, Paul James. Happy New Year, Paul, and thank you for joining us. Welcome to the show.
Thank you, Maryann. Happy New Year to you too.
Great. Paul, now there's been conversations over time about, especially after the 2023 elections that produce, the leaders that we have today, there have been conversations as to tweaking the Electoral Act that was actually amended under the Buhari administration. Also, obviously, because of the circumstances that surrounded that last election and several other off-cycle elections, which has, gotten Nigerians to begin to think that maybe it's not too late to tweak the Electoral Act for the 2027 elections. Now, there are several issues. IPAC recently had called on INEC to reduce the cost of elections because this is also affecting, in fact, they were talking about rearranging the election calendar. Most likely this will be affecting states like Osun, Anambra. These are states that don't have elections around the same time when the states and the federal government have their elections. But let's start from there. But we can't also talk about readjusting the election calendar without talking about how we got to this point. So I'll let you start from there.
Thank you so very much, Maryann. I agree. If you look at the electoral ecosystem, there is just so much to chew, especially as we pivot towards the 2027 election. And starting from the off-cycle election, how did we get there? You go back to the story of 2010, Peter Obi, Anambra State, Peter and this one that was the former Minister of Health, Chris Ngige. Mm-hmm. And how they keep going back and forth to the courts, and after that, court declared Peter Obi the winner of the gubernatorial elections in Anambra State. Mm-hmm. And then after that, through the action of the court declared that the day that, Peter went back to the court again to sort interpretation as to when will his tenure begin. Mm. And so the court ruled that the day that the court officially declared him as the governor was when the tenure was to start. And so from that moment, we start having these off-cycle elections, and then other states also follow suit. In fact, in 2012, we got even more states. States like Sokoto, Cross River, all also became somehow off-cycle. But then, the miracle that also happened was that going into the 2015 election, for whatever reason, all of those states also became like regular elections like other states. Mm-hmm. But after that, we got other 6 or 7 states that had also joined. Kogi is one, Bayelsa another, Osun, Ondo, Edo, Ekiti, and now also Imo, by also the action of the Supreme Court. Now, if you look at this, because these elections are happening outside the cycle of regular election, they come with their own kind of pressure. Mm. Every political machinery will be mobilized for the election. Politicians are trying to curry favor, so they use different kind of tactics, strong arm tactics, especially to win support from the people, the security and all of that. By my assessment, I would say, to be honest, in the last 4 or 5 years, that we have spent more conducting off-cycle election that we have spent also a regular election. If you think about the manpower, the time, and all of that, not just looking at the financial resources alone. But like I'll go back to the idea of the pressure. The quality of these elections at some point have also been questioned, not necessarily because the commission did not also do well, but because you also want to ask the question, was it a fair context based on what, go through the election? You look, for instance, the election that happened in September last year. I wouldn't say there was much of the quality of engagement by political parties, I would say, was not great. What they did was to save up until election. They engaged in vote buying. Not only did they engage in vote buying, what we saw was a kind of politically exposed persons that came to the state, all to get support for their party. The vice president was there, the Senate president was there, even on election day. More than 30 governors were in the state. Now, what does that mean? It will stretch even the resources that you have available in the state. It will stretch even the security that you want to provide for the election, because most of them will be going after providing security for the politically exposed persons, and then to the detriment of what they're also supposed to do on election day. Importantly, also, it will also put pressure on the management of the election itself, because, of course, if you have any other person that is at the polling unit and you say he or she will say this politically exposed person, without saying, you may also want to do something because you want to get quote unquote favor from this kind of people. So for me, it is the kind of pressure that comes with the election. And if you look at also the outcome of this election, the election keep oscillating. One election will be good, you will praise the election and you relax. The next election again, people will begin to question the outcome. Put Edo and Ondo side by side and see. A lot of people raise concerns about the outcome of the Edo election, especially the results that we saw from some local government. But we went to Ondo election and it did well. Now we may relax and say, oh, INEC has improved. Anambra is just before us. It's happening in November this year. You may go to Anambra and see a different outcome. So they come with their own challenges. I agree, to be honest, like the IPAC will say, can we go to a time where we can have all of this election happen in one day? But to do that, you also will need constitutional alteration, or you need also the instrument of the court to get that to happen. If you ask INEC itself, INEC will tell you that for them, it is also a lot of pressure to manage this election. Granted, some persons will say, oh, if you also look at it from the angle of the pecuniary gains that come with this election, maybe those that go to manage the election also benefit. But how about other risks of managing the election? There is a security risk. There is also the hazard of also interfacing with some of these persons in the state. The elections are also becoming increasingly challenging because as the commission is planning, the politicians are planning, the security is planning, but also non-state actors are planning to ensure the election does not happen. In every election, what do we keep saying? The risks of security. In the build-up to the election, you see that the security threshold will be so high that you wonder whether elections will happen. In the last Anambra election, it was an era where they said, no referendum, no election.
I was there. I was there 3 days before the elections.
Exactly. So if you look at the election that happened, it was like a theater of war before the election. Different issues around election-related violence. Even the election, as much as we thought it was a most peaceful process, in the build-up, there were concerns in places like Ose local government, Ifedore local government. Ose was a question of kidnappings that happened. Some core members are also kidnapped on the way going to the local government before they, in the build-up to the election. If there are communal clashes and all of that. But also, if you look at, like I will keep saying, the strong armed tactics that are employed by politicians, they will arm young people with weapons. They will introduce different shades of hate speech and all of that, and make the process almost like an election that will not happen. Election that will come, you'll see a different reaction, a different outcome from people. Turnout will be impacted because based on what people will say in the build-up to the election, they will decide not to participate. Look at the Edo election and how turnout trickled down over the years. Look at also the Ondo election. Ondo was abysmally 24% from the 34% or 32% that we had in the 2020 election, just in the space of 4 years. So that should worry any side Nigeria that also is interested in the progress of the country. We want to go back to that time. Maybe that will actually help if we are looking at areas to cost in our elections, because you also don't blame INEC. INEC last year budget was 40 billion. And then budget for 2025, we're talking about 126 billion, because it got to start planning for 2 off-cycle elections that will happen next year in Ekiti and Osun. it got to start planning for an FCT election that will also happen next year. Based on the electoral timeline, now they have to start planning 360 days before the election. And in the same vein, and they have to start planning for a CVA that will start this year. Continue voting.